Okay, the participants are coming on, so we'll just wait a couple minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be starting in just about a minute. Okay. So welcome to your first day of the 22-23 school year, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. In professional support services, our commitment is to continue our learnings in equity, decolonization, and anti-racism. If many of you and some of you may not know me, I'm Shameen Sandhu in the role of System Leader of Mental Health and Professional Support Services. For our new members, welcome. And I hope to meet some of you in person very soon. And some of the people I've known, again, in person too. We are happy today to have you join us for this presentation, which is the first module of many to come. This is Learning Today will provide a foundation of trauma-informed care from an equity and anti-racist lens. This presentation is titled Foundations of Understanding Trauma, Centering Equity and Engagement from an Anti-Oppression and Anti-Racist Lens. Previous works done on trauma-informed care have contributed to this current learning. Understanding and reframing trauma from a lens of equity is needed to understand the impact of social identities, oppressions, and racism, all of which have an impact on the well-being of students, and this will be centered. We need to extend the learning of trauma towards healing and engagement that affirm and honor student identities, their growth, assets, and brilliance. This does not mean we are not going to be aware of ACEs. It simply means that we are centering equity and the need to also be critical of the ways we are speaking about, learning about, and practicing trauma-informed care with students, so that we don't fall into traps that further stigmatize, racialize, and harm students of intersecting social identities. Our learnings and unlearnings as we center equity and anti-racism must include our reflections and actions to dismantle the deep systemic issues that perpetuate and maintain oppressions for young people and recreate culturally safe, positive, well-being, and inclusive spaces in and out of schooling. Understanding trauma from a healing, engagement, and equity lens is therefore critical. I want to extend my great gratitude to the mental health leads here, Amani Henny and Annette Grossi, who will be co-facilitating this learning today, and for the tremendous contributions and passion they have provided throughout this work. I'd also like to thank Roshni Malhotra for the ongoing support, care, and presence you have provided throughout. We also today want to acknowledge the folks who have been part of this development over the many years at TDSB, which include psychological department services staff, social work department staff, Rose Delamonte, manager of social work. We'd like to also extend an acknowledgement to Andrea Joyce, Alice Rubin Vaughn, Afshan Siddiqui, Kathy Cortese, Erica Lam Framboy, who's a BCBA, Amanda Ryan, a teacher who is central, Selene Tracy, Amy Paul, Amy Gomez. In addition, TDSB's Equity and Inclusion Department supported the creation of this with us, as well as the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement, Urban Indigenous Education Center, and our Human Rights Department. Therefore, welcome. And before we begin, I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. Next slide, Roshni. Thank you. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit people. In addition, with School Mental Health Ontario, next slide, please. We also, excuse me, want to acknowledge the Emancipation Day Acknowledgement of Slavery. On August 1st is the National Recognition of Emancipation Day, the abolition of slavery in Canada. It is a critical opportunity to increase awareness of Canada's complicity in slavery, racial segregation, and marginalization that has had devastating impacts on multiple generations of people of African descent. It also calls upon us to understand slavery as part of colonialism and Canada's project of nation building. The intention of this acknowledgement of enslavement of Africans, anti-Black racism, and Black excellence in Canada is to focus on the ongoing work of intentionality, reflection, and ongoing commitment. I would now like to introduce our wonderful facilitators, Amani Henny and Annette Grassi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Shameen. So today, for today's presentation, we just want to focus on a few things in terms of the pandemic. The pandemic has further brought to the forefront horrific effects of hate for all, anti-racism, racism, and historical oppression that has re-energized advocacy on all levels for equitable actions from all, no matter how small the commitment. Given the heaviness of the different impact of the pandemic, we have had to refocus all the trauma presentations to be inclusive for all with a deeper dive into culturally responsive and relevant theoretical assessment and treatment frameworks to guide our work over the next few years. With that being said, the next slide, please. The goals for this part one presentation is to look at what is the shared mental health language literacy regarding trauma from an equity and anti-oppression and anti-racist lens. We will review, the impact of the pandemic and how it disproportionately impacts the mental health and well-being of our BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our racialized, marginalized, and vulnerable communities. We will also review the historical and traditional perspective of trauma care and understanding, which is the new updated literature and research, that trauma is not a label. In keeping with that, we will also introduce the focus on trauma-informed care, along with healing-centered and asset-based framework, which is really immersed in a concept we refer to as community culture wealth perspective. So welcome, everybody. Next slide, please.
Thank you. And so before we begin, we do want to be mindful that even as support staff and those of us who are in health position, the content can be challenging, and we want to make sure that we are being mindful for ourselves. And as staff, if you need time to step away or to do some self-care, please be mindful. Our EFAP supports are in place as always, and continue to be available even for us. And if you hadn't had the chance already, My Path has a wonderful learning opportunity just to hear what EFAP offers to us in a deeper way. So I encourage you to go and check that out if you haven't already, and to check out some of the supports that EFAP can offer. Thanks. Next slide. So as we're doing a webinar presentation today, we do want to still give opportunity for some reflection. So we wanted to start just by asking, what is it that you think of when you hear trauma? What does it mean for you professionally? What does it mean for you personally? And if you just want to take maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds, just to kind of think about it, we can do that before we move on. Next slide, Roshni.
And so as we're thinking about what trauma means to us from our own professional background and also from our personal experience, we need to acknowledge, take this moment to acknowledge how the pandemic has really affected us as staff, our students that we work with, our families, and the different communities as well as globally. The pandemic, as we saw, has also magnified the disproportionate impact, as we stated before, on BIPOC communities, racialized and marginalized. And it has been challenging for everyone in different ways. And so in this presentation, we'll be looking at some of the research has stated in our second and third year of the pandemic from School Mental Health Ontario, the Crisis Center's Children's Help Phone, and other research that guided the development of this presentation so that we can have current information. Next slide, please. And so, you know, when we look at the impact globally and as well as in our communities, you know, the new language is losses, and losses is just not in terms of death of a loved one. It's about, you know, we saw the pandemic, instability, jobs, daily routines for, you know, everyone, in particular for our students, the transitional ritual celebrations of graduation and moving to grade 9. And, you know, some of our children have been on virtual classrooms for the last 3 years. So their choices have been taken away, their social and physical movements. And we also saw impact in terms of, you know, relationships and privileges. And so in keeping with the impact, we see the mental health issues that arise, such as, you know, the anxieties of the unknown, the uncertainty, and the challenging coping strategies, that unforeseen time that we've really had to, the word that we don't like to say, pivot to look at what are new ways of coping and the impact of the mental health and well-being, not only for our young people, but for us as support staff too. And so we just wanted to center that and just take moments to really consider where we are. We're not out of the pandemic, but it looks like we are on a path of hope and thriving at this time in our 3rd year with a higher rate of vaccination. And so we can only be hopeful that for this school year, things could be different and better with hope. Next slide, please. And so in our research for in further developing this presentation, we saw research from Sick Kids Hospital looking at Conversation Canada, and they did research that really looked at, you know, the impact of COVID. And the new language that they came out of their research is COVID stress syndrome. And this research was funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the University of Regina. And so they identified 5 COVID-related distress response, which we all felt would be key for us to have this new language and new mental health literacy going into this new school year. So they looked at the ways the pandemic has affected mental health, and they really centered the fact that, you know, it's a multifaceted syndrome that has interconnected symptoms, I'm sorry. And so, you know, the first one is danger and contamination fears. Then we had the socioeconomic concerns, as we saw with individuals who lived in priority neighborhoods, inner city. We saw the inequities in medical responses. And that came out into their research. We saw xenophobia and traumatic stress. And we saw that with the different racialized groups and the inequities and injustices that we saw. So that came out also within their research. And we saw the compulsive checking as well as reassurance seeking from youth. And we will have a part 2 to this training. And so we will go into a deeper dive and in-depth as to what this stress syndrome, COVID stress syndrome really means for us and the implication for our work as PSS staff. So, you know, this part 1 is just an overview of the foundations of the new direction of trauma within an equity and anti-oppression lens. Next slide, please. So there's also new research from Sick Kids Hospital that also looked at the impact of COVID-19 on children and youth mental health. And so the study found children and youth experience relatively similar overall mental health issues, no matter the clinical history. So whether or not they had a pre-existing diagnosis or not, they saw a sort of like a balanced response. And so, you know, there are some key noted ideas that, not ideas, summary that we saw from their research, and that for some children with pre-existing conditions, the stay-at-home directives actually helped their symptoms. It provided relief from sources of stress, therefore improving symptoms of anxiety and depression. And so that's really interesting for us to really understand. But we also saw that children with ASD or complex needs, students or ADHD, they lost the structure and consistency and the specialized care from our OT, PT psychologists that really helped them with their own safe environment. And we also saw, the research also saw familiar social interactions may have had negative impact on their mental health, that being taken away from them. So, this is just a general synopsis of this new research. So we wanted to really center that in this presentation, but once again, we'll go more in depth in part 2. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Amani. And as we start to, center the discussion around equity and mental health and what that means further, we start to see some of the research that, brought forward. It was really an opportunity to really highlight what we knew existed before, but did not spend the time to really focus in on why or how it impacted our students and families. So things like, understanding how gender plays a role in our mental health, understanding, identity, race, all of those things have really started to be highlighted more intrinsically in what we're seeing in our outcomes. But it also really helped us see the one basic thing was that those who experienced mental health issues prior to the pandemic were also those people who were experiencing inequities. And that intersection was really what we really started to focus in on in our discussions, in our work, as we start to say, what's next as we move forward. Next slide. So as Shameen had stated earlier, this isn't about not addressing the ACEs. It isn't about saying the ACEs aren't important. It's really about saying we understand the ACEs and we understand what that has done for us in reframing and understanding students in our school spaces, in our communities. But it's also starting to say now to us, what do we do with that information? And so for those who might not be familiar, the ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's a set of sort of a checklist that was devised through some studies that were looking at longitudinal sort of impacts on physical and mental health of those who experienced traumas within their childhood. And so here we find ourselves, saying, we understand that. Now it's about taking that information and moving forward with it and starting to value, things like that resiliency that exists, as children and adults. It does not frame who they are solely. And that, knowing impact and harm has been done, how do we move forward and create healing spaces? How do we start to focus on giving safe spaces to those who we know have been impacted by traumas? And I think what we're starting to see and understand is that word trauma loosely and will continue to be used very loosely because of the impact of the pandemic. Next slide. So looking further at the disproportionate impact of pandemic on the marginalized and racialized communities, it's important we understand that inequities are deeply connected to mental health. I think we have that clear understanding of what that means, who we're talking about, what that looks like, including things like anti-Black racism, anti-East Asian racism, the things that we were seeing as we were, shuttered in our homes, watching the news on a daily basis, and who exactly was being impacted. And then when we came back to schools, and we started to see the impact of what that was looking like for some of our students and families. But it also means that we have to start to focus on the assets and the resilience of those communities and learn from them and understand how we start to center voice and those lived experiences in our school spaces. Next slide. So then that just brings us to this sort of culminating, how do we bring it all together? So, we have inequities that have tremendous long-term and intergenerational impacts. We know that the COVID pandemic magnified those disproportionate impacts on marginalized and racialized communities. So we need to acknowledge, understand, learn, and unlearn is what we're really starting to focus on in this conversation today. And who we are as professional support staff, what we bring into our school spaces, into these conversations that we hope will continue with our staff and educational support staffs, and essentially families. Next slide.
Thank you, Annette. And if you can keep on clicking, Roshni, that would be great. And so as professional support staff, it's important for us to know how stigma impacts mental health and well-being, not only for ourselves, but also for our students and for the educators in which we work with. And so, sometimes these terms are thrown out, but we really don't have a deeper understanding at times about what exactly it means. So stigma is when someone views you in a negative way because you have a distinguishing characteristic or personality trait that's thought to be or actually is a disadvantage, a negative stereotype. And we see that with different intersecting identities, whether or not you're from a different gendered identity, sexual choices, religion. We see race and culture playing a part of that. But we also understand now that with the new information and new literacy, it also includes geography, neighborhoods. And, in our work, we've heard people say, when people see our postal code, they know where we live. And so therefore, they feel that they're discriminated against, or it's a stigma to apply for certain jobs when they know that their postal code will identify which neighborhood they're from. So, we look at the consequences of stigma and how it impacts our mental health and well-being. And some of the harmful effects of stigma can include reluctance to seek help and treatment, because of the lack of understanding, but it's all about internalized, how people see themselves. Or they may be from what we call in our work as PSS staff, close communities, or communities that maybe culturally don't have a good understanding about, not necessarily a good understanding, have their own understanding about what mental health and well-being, or may not even have the language in their culture for mental health. My background being from the Caribbean, mental health is seen as something superstitious, or it's hidden. You don't talk about those things, or we hide, anyone with complex needs or special needs from families in the community. So it's the beliefs and how, these feelings impact reaching out help. So in our work, in our assessments, this is also critical to really assess, is stigma a part of the not reaching out process, and how we can help our youth and our parents to really unpack what is really happening with them in a way that is culturally responsive. Next slide, please. And that brings us to, understanding the social determinants of health. We saw, or we will see, the wheel of well-being, in that, there's so many components that make up well-being, but, the social determinants of health is when we have meaningful connections to culture and communities, and that impacts positive outcomes. So, if we're looking at certain groups that may have a negative stereotypical view about who they are, just based on what race or culture they comes from, then that impacts their mental health and well-being. So social determinants of health is having a holistic view, coming together of resources within our school spaces and in our work. And how do we build community regardless of race, regardless of gender preference, regardless of religion and sexual orientation within our classrooms and school communities, and strengthening that engagement and relationships with our caregivers and the culturally responsive partnership and resource that we give to our students. And so we know that positive cultural perspective increases positive outcome and a sense of well-being. And that is where the direction in which will impact equitable as well as anti-oppression, anti-racism kind of mental health supports. Next slide, please.
So as Mani mentioned, we look at things like the wheel of well-being as a tool to kind of help us sort of understand, who's before us, who they are within their identities, within their cultures, within their races, within their faiths, and what that impacts on them, positively or perhaps, and I think it's really, just about us so that we support our staff and our communities, school communities, to understand we see people as whole, sentient beings, rather than just that one aspect before us, right? And realizing what tools are there that they have access to, and what barriers might be in place because of who they are, and how we then can support them being able to access things like, housing, access to, more food security, if those are the issues that are at hand, relating back to the social determinants of health. Next slide. So we wanted just to kind of bring it back to some of the research done by Public Health Canada, and this came early on in the pandemic, but it was really, I think, poignant for them to sort of highlight what they obviously already knew, and how we start to move forward in an equitable way to ensure that, all people were able to be resilient. As much for us to say, just be resilient. But if those tools are not accessible, then it's not really going to be feasible for people to be resilient. Some of the, the main points that they made were things like, who has that health access to those health clinic, who has access to mental health supports, and what does that look like? Making sure schools were resilient. That was a bit of a broad term they used, but it really was about sort of saying we need to make sure our school spaces are inclusive, accessible, and meaningful to our students, no matter who they are or where they come from. Next slide. And so that brings us kind of to this point of being, that we are all part of the circle of support for our students, as us, in a different role as PSS, but, as we start to draw people into these conversations and understanding things like trauma in an informed way, how do we start to build a circle of care around the students that, come into our buildings every day? And I think this is the point of what we are here to do today, is really start to say, how do we build these inclusive, engaging, and healing spaces? Next slide.
And so, Roshni, if you can keep on clicking, please. So we're starting today's presentation at this point, forgive me, with reframing how we discuss trauma. And so, generally as PSS staff, we know some of this information. Often, that trauma often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing trauma event can harm a person's sense of safety and well-being and who they are. And it affects them emotionally and how they navigate their world and relationships. And so living with trauma long after an event, we see that in our work, that it can continue to feel like they're reliving that, depending on if they're triggered and by what triggers are in their spaces, the feeling of fear and shame and powerlessness. But there's also in the subconscious where, sometimes the trauma is repressed, and how, our children and youth behave is beyond their understanding. So that's where our work comes in, where the trauma experiences overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And so with the new information and new literacy, we're looking at not making trauma the face of our youth and those and students that we work with. And instead of asking what is wrong with them, which is very much entrenched in a historical way of assessing trauma, to what has happened to you. And so that is more the healing-centered language and engagement, which we'll be really looking at in building our foundational understanding of this new language. Next slide, please. And so, we wanted to give a visual in that, there's the assumption when it comes to trauma from grief, that over time, things will get better. And time will make things, the feeling, less overwhelming, and they will get over it, but not understanding that, the supports are needed to help our students with what the new concept is post-traumatic growth. What supports do we give for the concept of healing spaces, right? And trauma does not go away. And it doesn't get smaller over time. It is more suppressed if the support or the culturally relevant support or understanding of framing it within possibility of healing is not present, especially for our children and youth. Next slide, please. And so if we keep clicking, that would be great. And so we just wanted to take a look at currently, we know a lot of the trauma that we will be helping our youth and children with over the next couple of years will be the COVID related traumas, the pandemic losses, not just death, but the losses as we discussed before. And we do have the traumatic griefs. There's been, it's the elephant in the room where it's challenging for our youth and young students to really talk about how they're feeling, because they may not have the language, or their emotions are just all over the place and it's exhibited behaviorally. New concept, new language around racial trauma and how racism and discrimination does impact the social determinants of health and well-being. We saw Taboo in public health in 2020 having the first Black Mental Health Day. And so, that goes for other races as well, not just one race, and that racism does create stress and distress, and it culminates into racial trauma. Also with institutional racism that has been magnified during the pandemic from year one. And, this is not an exhaustive list, but, human trafficking, we now have training on that, where it's the underbelly of society, where we do know that this is happening to our students in schools. And, we're so used to dealing with child neglect and with childhood abuse. But the new language is that, those that are coming to us as refugees from countries in war, and we see what's happening currently, in many countries, and our students are witnessing and are exposed to torture and kidnapping and war. And so how do we help our students in our assessments and providing support for the next couple of years? So centering that which we know, especially with the impact of the COVID-19 and the pandemic. Next slide, please. And so this is really key for us, the trauma continuum. And yes, as PSS staff, we have an idea of how trauma is processed, but we felt we needed to go in depth in this trauma continuum. And it looks at how the mind processes trauma events in terms of the perceived sense of safety. So let's keep it in the framework of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The physiological need takes priority for children and adults as well. Food, clothing, shelter. Then we have the safety needs, which is a sense of personal safety, housing safety, love and belonging comes next, as well as self-esteem. So if we keep that in mind, then we look at how trauma impacts individual from an incidental trauma to a multiple and pervasive trauma to life-altering kind of process. So if we see it's on a continuum of how it's processed according to the individual sense of safety is from mild to moderate to more severe. So trauma, the first one, while feeling safe, if a person feels safe, they will process that information, and it's the studies indicate that they will complete the internal process and release that experience. And then, if they're feeling moderately safe, their defense mechanism is enacted, they'll process and release the incident or the experience. But then it becomes more complex, where there's no sense of safety. And the experience becomes heavier and more detrimental, where there's no defense mechanism, there's no sense of safety, no safety net for themselves in terms of their identity formation. And there's the difference in coping is that the mind suppresses the experience, right? And so then we go to the last two, which is on the PTSD continuum, right? Where the trauma is repressed, because then it's continuous. And, for a psychologist, it's the limbic system. And we had to really look at the neurobiological responses to trauma, which we will go very in depth in our second presentation, and where the trauma cannot be processed. And it's organized in a way that it's suppressed, and our youth, they don't have access to that. But then we see the behaviors from that. So more profound the trauma, the deeper it's buried and repressed, and the complex trauma, also the severe end of PTSD, it's deeply repressed and more difficult to access and more profound the psychological disturbances. So as I said, it's safety according to Maslow's hierarchy of need, and how it's internalized is very key to our work as well. Next slide, please. And so we'll just go over generally, as I think as PSS staff, we are familiar with the types of trauma. It's on a continuum of type 1, type 2, type 3. And so, type 1 is more the trauma that is a single incident. Not that it doesn't have the same impact, but as we learned in the previous slide, if a person feels a sense of safety, it's processed differently, right? So it's very key for us to have the shared language, which enables us to receive and assess a situation with our youth. Type 2 trauma involves repetitive experiences that are terrifying and harmful and creates a lot of hurt. These can rarely be spoken, these experiences, about due to the shock, possible threats, loyalty issues depending on the trauma and whether or not there was coercion. Oftentimes there's confusion depending on the age of the child, or a disassociative, can't say that word, forgive me, response due to the level of terror and powerlessness, right? Then we get to type 3, the more pervasive trauma. And it's positioned at the furthest end and involves multiple traumatic, different experiences that are serious, repeated. We see that it could be multiple types of abuse, violence, sexual abuse, neglect over many years. But now we're seeing that other traumas could be, as we stated before in our 2 circles, it could be a victim of war, a refugee, it could be institutional racism, it could be racial racism, it could be, our 2S LGBTQ community and our trans community that are being targeted. As we saw in COVID, we saw the murders of Black and brown bodies. And we saw even here in Canada, our Indigenous communities that are also being murdered in the discovery of residential graves. So this is how we're being inclusive of understanding the complex trauma. Next slide, please. And so if you can keep clicking, Roshni, that would be great. So we'll just go over this generally, and you all can read this in terms of acute and single trauma, referencing that to the 3 types of trauma. It mainly results, as I said, it from a single distressing event. And we see the possible responses, the anxiety, the feeling of disconnection from the surrounding and from relationships, not feeling safe, and unreasonable lack of trust and aggressive behavior. We see that in some of our, refugees that come from war-torn countries. We see that racial racism and institutional racism when, individuals, especially from our BIPOC community, Black and Indigenous, where they have met to not feel like they belonged, will not trust individuals in the building, no matter how hard you try, unless there's a foundational understanding of how that could impact connectedness. The inability to focus on schoolwork or to study, lack of self-care or grooming is just not neglect. They're indicators as well. Next slide, please. So we're moving to the chronic and the complex trauma, which is the series of events, which we discussed before. And, it's multiple and it's chronic, it's overlapping and succession. We see that, keep clicking, Roshni, please. We see with our young people and even adults, when we're talking about human trafficking, the overlapping succession of these experiences, and how, some people are targeted. And so, the possible responses, the unpredictable emotional outbursts in our students, extreme anger, fatigue, our psychologists, when they're doing their assessments, we see the ADHD on a continuum as well, those who are unmotivated or seem really flat. And that's an understanding that I really came to understand from my colleagues in their assessments, and headaches. And so where did that all come from, and to really look deeper. Next slide, please. We're also seeing how the intersection of racial trauma, which is part of, click again, Roshni, which is part of the complex trauma. And this is new language, right? Where individuals that experience overt, covert racism, discrimination, experiences of microaggression, biases with a conscious, we're not just talking about young people and youth, we're talking about adults as workers in institutions that experience racial stress and distress, intentionally targeted, whether overt or covert. And this culminates in racial distress and racial trauma. And so, you know, when we look at systemic racism, we're looking at prolonged over time historical trauma, and we're looking at intergenerational trauma, all located in the chronic and complex trauma category. So this is building a new understanding of where racial trauma is placed on this continuum. And so we look at understanding systemic racism, how historical legacy of being stolen and colonialism with inaccurate perception of threat, being silenced because of race and culture, isolated, not feeling like they belong in institution in everyday spaces they are perceived as stress in everyday life, culminates into racial trauma. And we're all familiar with systemic racism, even though some people feel that it doesn't exist. And that comes from your own intersecting identity and social location. But, you know, institutions, TDSB, the government has acknowledged is that institutional racism exists, right? It refers to the way that whiteness and white superiority became embedded in the policies and processing of an institution. And that is the belief, and white supremacy, we have to define that as well as white privilege, that the belief that white people are superior to people of other races. And it's reflected and upheld in systems. And it looks at larger structural institutional operations other than individual biases and behaviors. And, you know, sometimes there's an uncomfortability with hearing the term white privilege, whiteness. And I need to let you know that as a Black professional, I've had to become comfortable with Black male, Black magic. And so how we use language is also very key. And we need to, you know, part of having courageous conversation is acknowledging our discomfort, but we do have to move forward with understanding the equitable help that we need to understand and to reflect and unlearn to be able to move forward. Vicarious trauma and transmitted trauma. We see that with many of our newcomers or racial individual, you know, for example, our residential Indigenous families, we see the exposure to trauma stories and which develops over time. And it's the intergenerational racial oppression, stress and distress stories experienced over time that's passed down a generation to generation. The effects are still there. And, you know, that's where the collective response of hurt and harm comes in. So the first year of the pandemic, when we saw the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, we saw the death of and the discovery of Indigenous bodies here in Canada and the residential graveyards. You know, Kids Help Phone, they saw an increase in calls from Black and Indigenous youth, and they were staying on longer and having more distress calls. So can you imagine the adults from those racial groups and our allies that are very inclusive in understanding and interrogating their own privilege and understanding other racial experiences, the collective harm and pain that they also felt. And so that translated also into transmitted trauma, right? The collective racial stress and distress, which results in depression, anxiety. And here it is, the lack of safety in your world every day, day to day. Don't assume that me as a Black professional going into different spaces, I don't necessarily feel comfortable, because I do still experience everyday racism within institutions, even though I've been a social worker for over 30 years. And so part of the chronic and next slide, please.
Thanks, Money. I think that brings us to this slide here. And if you could just click through it, Roshni, it really speaks to that persistent toxic stress in our environments. And it happens within institutions, it happens in our communities, it happens, when you walk into your local, convenience store. It's that constant feeling of uncertainty about who you are, where you stand, and that sort of stress that sort of culminates because of that. And those toxins are all interrelated to the social determinants of health, which loops us back to this conversation, is that when you live in this circumstance where you're constantly dealing with things like microaggressions, you're constantly put into a place where you're not made to feel that you belong, that constant toxic stress starts to rain down on you. And what does that create is this sense of hopelessness, that sense of uncertainty, that sense of that lack of safety that we know we require in order to be able to start that healing. And so it is really important we sort of highlight these things within these conversations and understand that this is something that we know happens within our school spaces. We know it happens in our communities. So we need to address the fact that this impact has had, a longer term impact, in that feeling of hopelessness now becomes an issue of, now I'm not able to do the things I'm expected to do. Now I'm not keeping up. Now I'm not belonging. And now I'm feeling disengaged and don't want to. And so really highlighting this piece at this point was something we wanted to ensure we bring forward to the conversations, as well as we start to think about what's next with these trauma, this understanding of trauma. We start to talk about what's next. Next slide, please. So that brings us now into, that foundational conversation around trauma responses. And for many of us, our familiarity with fight or flight is there. It's solid. We understand where that comes from. We understand maybe the science behind all of that. But as we're doing our research and as we start to build our library of information around trauma, we start to see that there's a deeper growing understanding of these trauma responses and what they look like. So we're going to focus on the 6 F's. So the fight, flight, fright, fawn, freeze, flooding, and fatigue or flop. As we move through the slides, we'll get a little deeper into that. Next slide. So we know fight or flight, it's based out of our sympathetic nervous system. It's a response, an increase in cortisol. We know that certain people, when they're in a stressful or traumatic situation, some people fight, they become irritable and angry, they become aggressive, they move toward the danger, while others might flee, and mothers might feel that fear and anxiety, that panic, the chronic worry, things like perfectionism show up as a flight response. We started to understand more and more about our polyvagal and dorsal vagal nerve and what that means in terms of our response to freeze. So things people, might, do a physical collapse. They might just stop. They might just dissociate, space out. They might sort of get rooted and stuck in like depression and shame within a freeze response. And then the fawn response is, that person who responds to a stressful situation by wanting to fix it or having a, solution. I'll step in, or I'll take care of this for you. You don't need to worry about it. That sort of need to please is a trauma response, very much so as well. Next slide. But we start to look at things like flooding and fatigue, and we start to understand that, as much as, that those 4 rooted ones that we understand too that people respond by stopping and, maybe retreating and doing things like sleeping as a response to their stressful or traumatic situation. We're flooded, and we're in front of something that we're not able to manage or cope with, and we'd refer to we would look at it as that sort of response to feeling sleepy. I think I used the example once of during the pandemic, I found that my teenager slept all the time. It was an easy thing for him to do. It was an easy way for him to respond to this constant uncertainty of where do I go? How do I do this? Being online is not working for me. I'm not able to see my friends. I'm not able to act in the same way. So this is how we do these things. The next slide. Thanks, Roshni. So as we've mentioned, this is sort of where we become dysregulated, and we see it physically. Perhaps we see these things happening much in the same way we might see somebody in a flight response or a fight response. It's very similar, but that overwhelming feeling, sort of comes in with clinical implications. So we can see that when a child's upset, they're not thinking straight. They're not able to sort out what they want you to do. I probably had the conversations with staff. This is when we use minimal language. This is when we keep, a quiet tone. This is when we help them with their co-regulation, and we find ways to help them manage. We listen to them, or if a kid needs to express their anger, it's not about dismissing it or telling them to stop being angry. It's about letting them find a way to express it in a way that works for them. We're there, and we're there to help people understand. Our job is to get young people to a balanced state once again, where they can start to think through the problem. And it might happen within that, few moments, or it might happen much later on down the road. But we're able to, also let people help them let go of their feelings and not remain stuck. And those are some of the pieces of what we want to try and help our students when they're in that regulated state. Next slide. And then that brings us to that fatigue or flop. And so feeling that tired or sleepy in response to our perceived threats, just kind of seeing that kid who might have had a really rough recess, who comes back in and just kind of puts their head down on the desk, or is just, staring off into space, sort of numbing, not really responding to questions or any kind of interventions and supports. It is similar to a meltdown and similar to distress symptoms. And they might need some help to find their way to even realize what they're feeling at that moment. And it will take some, time and understanding to really kind of get to the root of what's going on for them. But it really is just as you would think it would be. It would be just a young person who was just not able to sort of engage in the directions or, the routines that are before them within a classroom space. And in a flight response, our muscles go limp. And so we might just see that kid who just kind of finds that wall and just slides down and just sits there, without sort of responding for a moment. And just, recognizing that our bodies do different things in these circumstances is really what we hope our colleagues and staff in school spaces start to see is that we're really getting better within our fields to understand what trauma responses look like and what they seem to be and how we then can respond to them. Because as much as we love a student who's obliging us and who's helpful to a kid in a crisis, I mean, we want to start doing better at asking ourselves, is this somebody who themselves are in a trauma response as well? And how do we help regulate that person as well? So I think really what we want to do in this foundational aspect of conversation is start to look deeper at understanding those trauma responses, so we can then give the tools to our school spaces and colleagues to know how to sort of help support our students and families. Next slide. And so that brings us to the next level of our conversation is how do we start to take all this knowledge and how do we start to take some of what we've already learned forward? So we don't also perpetuate that notion of saying trauma informed, trauma ACEs. And so knowing that we are starting to look at, how do we identify and give our students, spaces that are healing and, promote healing. So, talking about things like knowing there's more to what happened to you, as we've mentioned earlier before, that as much as trauma has happened, it's happening inside as well. How do we start to help, those healing tools be accessible to students in our school spaces? And, you know, what does that child need to discuss when it comes to that trauma? What do they want to focus on? What do they want to share? And giving them voice, or giving them space that requires not that they revisit or discuss any of it, but really start to say, you're more than that. How do we help you find those tools so you see that, but we can start to make sure that you see yourself beyond that as well. And so we want to, next slide.
Annette, if you can just stop for a second before we play that slide. And I
Yeah.
just want to have a qualification, a clarification here in that as PSS staff working in the school board, we're not asking you to be therapist, right? We know that there will be some students that will have to be referred out for the complex and chronic trauma. And the goal for having this foundational presentation is, which we'll go into further, is we have that window of tolerance. And how do we help those students to cope within the school system and work as a collective support staff to really ensure that they get the referral to those child and youth treatment centers where they can delve deeper into those very complex and chronic trauma. So I just want to qualify that we're not asking for you all to delve into the more complex and the more traumatic trauma. We're looking at how do we help our students to cope day to day. And if we see that they're not coping day to day as a team, you know, with the psychological assessment for complex needs, the OTPT, the speech, as well as with our social work and child and youth workers, how do we work together to be able to help our students to have moments of calm? What if we use zones of regulation or other services, knowing that there's a short-term plan and a long-term plan? So I just wanted to qualify that before we move on.
Thanks, Moni. Okay, if we can move to the next slide. I think that's our video. So with just a quick video from Gabor Mate.
Trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you. That's a good thing, by the way. Because if trauma, in terms of what happened to me as a Jewish infant under the Nazis, if that was the trauma, I'll never be a person who wasn't a Jewish infant under the Nazis and during that period of genocide. If trauma is the fact that you were abused as a child, you will never be a person who wasn't abused as a child. Trauma can also be inflicted not by what happens to you, but what doesn't happen that should happen. So that when your needs aren't met, that can wound as well. Even though you weren't overtly hurt, you were still wounded by not having your essential human needs met. But if that was the trauma of what happened to you, guess what? It'll never unhappen. But if trauma is what happened inside you, the wound that you sustained, the meaning you made of it, the way you then came to believe certain things about yourself or the world or other people. And if trauma was that disconnection from the authentic self, well, guess what? Good news. That can be restored at any moment. So that's why, Sharon, when you talk about the new view of trauma, when we see it as that wound, as long as we see it that way, it's a wound that can be healed. If we see it as a bunch of things that happened, that'll never unhappen. But we don't have to, the biggest lesson for me, and one I continue to have to learn, is that we don't have to allow it to define our lives, how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we relate to the world, other people, how we relate to possibility, how we relate to even spiritual transformation.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Dr. Gabor is just a guru for me. I like watching his videos, and I know that he is one of our foundational individuals in the world of trauma. We were supposed to take a break, but I guess we'll continue on for a few slides, and Annette, you'll cue me as to when we can take a break. Okay. So we're starting with our new foundational knowledge. And I know it's information overload, but we do have a part 2 where we'll break this down further in terms of the implications clinically for us as PSS staff. So the new concept of healing-centered care is asset-based approach and mattering. And so we do have a visual of the phase one, where how does a student and a youth develop a sense of safety and a sense of self-esteem to be able to get an understanding that they matter to you? So, you know, the practice-based approach is creating safe spaces where students will feel included, like they belong. And in our work, our engagement and listening and hearing without judgment, you know, understanding their intersecting identities. And, you know, even looking at our complex needs students, you know, how they matter with their own intersecting identities. And we do know that there is sometimes an adultification of racialized students with ASD, and their behaviors are interpreted differently. So how do we go into these spaces and making them feel like they matter and support and create trusting relationships within communities for us as PSS staff or classroom or educators with ourselves? And then, you know, that will help us to learn more about the students, regardless of their intersecting identities, the parents, you know, those two graphs we showed, you know, it could be that they're newcomers. You know, do we work with our, you know, settlement workers, and do we get to understand what they're experiencing? And so can you imagine if we're able to create those trusting relationships, that they can get to a sense of mattering to themselves, not only mattering to us, and that they understand that they have the power to create their own path in life. As Dr. Gabor stated, you know, what is their purpose to their authentic self, to help them re-narrate or really discover mattering and a sense of security for themselves, and, you know, to help them recognize the impact of trauma for us on their developing brain and various manifestation of trauma, which we went through. But to get to phase 3, that they matter to the world, is critical. You know, and to understand that the power of their own actions and beyond. Now, this doesn't happen in a year. It doesn't happen in 2 days. It doesn't happen in 2 years. But if we have a longitudinal kind of perspective and support, where, you know, the tier system, you know, we refer out the tier 3 for the more critically harmed students that need, you know, external care, to get to that stage of I matter to the world and to themselves. You know, that is our hope. That is our vision through asset-based approach. Next slide, please. And so then that we wanted to define, well, you know, how do we help our youth and students and build a sense of self and belonging? And the 5 components of building a culture of belonging and mattering in school is the attention, the engagement without judgment, the attention of their intersecting identities, whether they're 2S LGBTQ+, trans, indigenous from different tribes. I say tribes because I'm African, but you know, what is their background? You know, that they're important to somebody, even though they may not feel important to anyone. If you look back to the asset base we're talking about, being important to someone as a way of building safe relationship and building confidence. And, you know, we all have moments in our spaces. When I was frontline, and there were some students who wouldn't really speak, but I would let them know during lunchtime, come and sit inside, my door is open. I would have 4 or 5 students just sitting there eating, you know, not really saying anything to me, but they were sure that I created a space where they wouldn't have to apologize. They wouldn't have to ask if they needed to come in. They knew they belonged, and they could get away from the hallways and what was happening or reliving. And so building that confidence, sometimes it's not wording, and sometimes it's not going from a script. It's building a safe space, you know, that they need, and to appreciate who they are, you know, and letting them know that they matter. So we wanted to just focus on that. As I said, part 2, we go more in depth, but we wanted to just give a synopsis of the direction in which we're thinking, that we feel could be also culturally relevant and culturally responsive when it comes to equity and inclusion. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed healing-centered care, what that is, I'm sorry, Annette, I'll just finish this. As I stated, it's just to summarize, you know, we support trauma healing through connections, as I stated, you know, identity affirming and cultural responsive. And the whole concept about identity affirming is ensuring that all students, regardless of intersecting identities, have positive perception of their own culture or cultures. And not because of the historical colonialist view that certain BIPOC individuals have no redeeming qualities, we need to intersect our own learning of the negative aspect of colonialism or the inaccurate hidden history you may have about certain races. And in moving from just including ACEs to trauma-informed to healing-centered care, looking at providing the information that's needed to encourage connectedness and to recognize that trauma may be ongoing, and they may be experiencing that, but we want to create safe spaces and to continue to build a circle of care of students within our schools. And we know that that's been an issue with institutional racism. And how do we challenge ourselves to recommit and to do our own learning and unlearning, whether it be uncomfortable, but that level of uncomfortability says a lot for us. Courageous conversations, and how do we have that with ourselves to be able to help our students regardless of intersecting identities. Next slide, please.
So we have a few slides that are left, but I wonder if it would be prudent to take a little break right now, just to give people an opportunity to stretch, maybe grab a glass of water. We're not too far from the end, but just to have an opportunity just to take a breath, because it is a lot of content and information. So if we could just take 5 minutes right now, just to take a moment, and then we'll regroup. So it's 1:34, so we'll say 1:39 diligently.
Or 1:40.
1:40. You like those even numbers, right?
Even numbers.
Okay. Just so people have an opportunity to take a break.
Wonderbar.
Thanks.
Roshni, will you pause the recording? So, wonderbar, we're recording again. All right, Annette, go for it.
Thank you. Okay, so for those not familiar, this is Dr. Sean Ginwright, and he's very much rooted in what we're talking about here today in terms of our healing-centered engagement. So please watch the video, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about his theories and ideas.
Create opportunities for young people to heal by detoxifying ourselves and detoxifying young people to their exposure to social toxins. And so when we talk about healing-centered engagement, there are really 4 things that I want you to think about. And that the first thing is healing-centered engagement is explicitly political rather than clinical. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a clinical approach to healing presumes that you can just treat someone or some exposure to some form of harm. When we think of it politically, is we take in consideration the conditions that created harm in the first place. It builds agency. It builds the ability for young people to speak to the issues that impacted them. If you take, for example, March for Our Lives, young people having voice and agency about gun violence, Black Lives Matter, right? All of these issues where young people are engaged in, they're having a voice, is a form of healing because it's speaking to the conditions that created the harm. Now, this isn't just me that says this. The research suggests the same thing. Isaac Prelatinsky's research suggests that when young people are developing a sense of agency, political awareness, and engagement, that has an impact on their ability to have a sense of control over their lives. That sense of control contributes to well-being. And so when we call healing a political act, we have to think about the ability and the capacity for young people to respond in a way to address the issues that cause the harm in the first place. The second is healing-centered engagement is explicitly culturally grounded, and it views healing as a restoration of identity. That means that we have to put identity at the center of our healing processes. I remember one of my own healing as a young person, as a child, was I grew up in a neighborhood where we hated being Black. We would talk about our dark skin and our thick lips and our kinky hair, right? And that was reinforced by the commercials on television. Culture wasn't a part of the ecosystem and where I grew up. And so I had to unlearn my self-hatred around ethnic and racial identity. And so when we talk about culturally grounded, we have to put young people's identity and heal from that identity. Now, it's not just racial and ethnic identity. It could be gendered identity, right? It could be class identity. It could be any identity, but it means that we take identity and place it central in our work with young people. But it also means that we have to interrogate our own identities, right? What does it mean to be a white person working with a group of African American or Latino young people? What does it mean to be a Latino working with a group of white young people? It means that we can't presume that our identities don't matter, and that we have to create opportunities for young people to heal from the ways in which their identities have been harmed. Healing-centered engagement is asset-driven, and it focuses on the well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress, right? So when we talk about trauma-informed care, it tries to reduce symptoms. When we talk about healing-centered engagement, it is dream-driven. That means that we talk about what are the dreams and aspirations young people want? What are the assets that they bring into our youth development programs? And we begin to create opportunities for them to have an imagination about their lives so that they can begin to move forward in a positive way. And lastly, healing-centered engagement supports the adults with their own healing. And as I said before, we can't presume that we can heal and support young people without our own healing as well. And so in our journey to provide profound youth development and healing, right, we have to begin to reimagine our work with young people.
Thank you. Next slide. So I don't know if many people have had the opportunity to watch any of Dr. Ginwright's work before this, but it really is inspiring to hear him speak because he puts it in such a way that I think we all just really start to say that makes the utmost sense. And why haven't we started to think that way sooner? But if you're not familiar, you know, he breaks it down very, very meaningfully into 5 parts. So healing-centered engagement consists of really restore
and let me step in and do this. So he breaks it down into relationships, you know, to create spaces that we talked about before, to be vulnerable, empathetic without judgment. Then we have the cultural, restorative, and affirming conversation about our identities, right? And what do those conversations look like? Are those conversations free of your own prejudged notions of what that person with their intersecting identities should be, ought to be, and not listening to where they're coming from, their own positive affirmation of who they are. And to give young people agency and voices. We've heard him speak about that, right? And to help them to find their voices. And, you know, we have that mentorship programs for Students for Wellbeing, as well as we hope that in your work, you know, we can support in many ways in different platforms in providing avenues for student voices. And how do we help them with their meaning, rediscovering? And, you know, for us as PSS staff, narrative therapy, you know, and that was about putting their own meaning to their experiences and aspirational growth. That is the dreaming. And there's a new concept which we will, for some, we will talk about, which is post-traumatic growth. And that's where I'm at in my own personal life in terms of taking as many courses around, you know, post-traumatic growth, which is very key, and it could be inspiring and help our young people on a journey of believing that, you know, they can work towards growth and that they are not the faces of the trauma, which is a very different shift in perceiving trauma, especially working for us as PSS staff, working with children and youth. Next slide, please. Annette. Okay.
Let me try this again.
Okay, you're good. Stay right there.
Thanks. A healing-centered approach obviously views trauma not simply as an individual isolated experience, but rather highlights the ways in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. We have to move away from this notion of the individual, and we have to recognize the impact that the collective experiences, because within that collective are the tools that many have used throughout their lives to be able to heal. And it helps to know that you're not alone in these processes and in these journeys. This is a holistic approach. It looks at culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. Those conversations aren't just about, the identity and the experiences you might have within your family context or your faith or your race or your community. It's also about how you're going to work together and change things together, and what kind of things you're going to put in place to create action to make those changes happen. It's an approach to view trauma with a lens that promotes holistic views of healing from traumatic experiences and environments. It's not just looking at the individual, it's looking at who they belong to, use each other, support that.
So let me jump in and also add that it's also about looking at, different racial groups' perspective about healing. We see the mindfulness, we see individual restorative practice, and that's been incorporated in restorative circle. And, what do others from different cultures have in terms of spiritual healing, and not just Eurocentric based notions of healing that has been impacted and historically have been the forefront. So now we're challenging that notion of, and we see through evidence that we need to look at intersecting views of, what healing looks like for everybody. And in looking at what healing looks like, we get to the root of the stigma. And, in our work, can we clarify some of that based within Canadian context, the openness and engagement that we have? And so next slide, please, and try again. Annette? Okay, so is this me or you? So we're looking at, here's a new concept of trauma responsive care and cultural community. So, we're not saying we are deviating from ACEs. What we're looking at is how do we enhance and add? And so, in the school communities, we have trauma responsive care, and that's responding to others in a way that promotes safety on many levels, right? Not just culturally, but also in terms of identity affirming for to us LGBTQ communities, for newcomers, for Indigenous communities, and how do we empower and foster healing? And we can't really get to culturally responsive and healing centered if we don't have it, as Dr. Sean indicated, we have to have cultural humility. What does that mean? And it's maintaining an interpersonal stance that is open to the most important aspect of the other. BIPOC communities are often othered. And so how do we be open to the others and cultural identity and identity affirming perspectives? Next slide, please. And so just keep clicking. So we wanted to have action. So cultural humility is an action. We're a part of several cultures, right? Intersecting identities. What are your own values? And are you aware of the values of others, their history and culture, and not really looking at, well, my value and my background is top level or second level and others are of no worth. So that's power and privilege. How do we disrupt power and privilege and really hear what are the values of other cultures? So cultural humility is not cultural competence. So, when I graduated from my master's in the 90s and 2000, won't age myself, cultural humility, competence was the key thing. There was a belief that, oh yeah, you can become culturally competent in learning how to work with other races. And how can you become an expert? So, you're going to enter a safe space, a therapeutic space, having an expert stance, that is privilege, right? That's privilege posturing. And so how do we engage in continual discovery of beliefs and bias and stereotypes and judgments and be open to that? And you can only be open to that if you interrogate your own. So that, because, implicit and explicit bias, sometimes we don't know if we're being judgmental, which goes for me as well, as a racialized woman. When I see someone, a white person with a bald head, I'm thinking skinhead, but it could just be they have alopecia or, I have to stop and say to myself, my people, my race have been, what did that image represent? And so I have to interrogate that myself. And, we really have to look at hidden history. We hear about, Black history, Indigenous history, racialized history, but we don't hear about white history. Don't hear about, the historical legacy of also being descendants of individuals who stole people. So, people didn't settle themselves. They didn't enslave themselves. And so when we learn and unlearn historic and current systems of oppression and racism, that's really important to explore where we are and where we're centered as PSS staff. And that helps us to really listen and look at all history, right? And so that will lead us to really interrogate the mistrust. And this mistrust needs to be uprooted and visible in supporting healing. And we can't do that without us, as Dr. Jen Wright stated, doing our own work. And doing our own work is very key. And we look in part 2 about our own work. There's a huge section on that. And if we get to do this in person, it's about, following, the rules of having courageous conversation without, targeting someone and insulting them and making them feel guilty. I am not a fan of white fragility. I am a fan of interrogating, because I think that put a person on the defensive. And I think fragility is in all races, right? And so that's my personal view, and to have that courageous conversation about that. And for us to be lifelong learners, right? To learn to listen and require us to be flexible, to readjust and learn and unlearn. And 1 or 2 workshops not going to do it. I am still taking diversity and inclusion courses, because my goal is how can I help to foster inclusivity? And there's strategies that I continue to learn, and I'm middle-aged, and I am a lifelong learner in fostering this. Continue on, please. Next slide. And so in our quest in developing these workshops, we wanted updated information. And this is actually a 2022 presentation by, I think it's Brock University. It's only a very short video, but it tells us what the focus will be for the 2022-23 school year. If you can play that, please, Rashni. Thank you.
We found changes in young people's relationship with parents and with siblings, and an increased closeness that at times they described as unnatural. So that these young people who were moving were changing in schools, or changing, perhaps looking to move out, for example, that was really challenging, and they didn't have the support they needed. They felt alone. The hardest hit for those seemed to be young people with disabilities, seemed to be LGBTQ youth, seemed to be youth who maybe were already facing challenges. And so a young person who lived in a household where they didn't experience support, perhaps they were LGBTQ and they didn't have a lot of support from family members, they felt really stuck and were in environments that perhaps didn't provide them the support they needed, or the relationships they needed, or even were sometimes hostile. Young people also told us about more distant relationships with friends, extended family, and family living outside of their household. So for example, young people who had a parent who they didn't live with. Children and youth also lost out on extracurricular and other activities, and they moved into doing more household-based activities. So things like baking, increasing their use of technology. Young people also described experiencing more boredom, more worry, and gratitude. And younger participants reported feeling anger as well as a result of the pandemic. Across all the ages that we talked to, participants also told us about new things they were doing to cope. So things like spending time outside in nature, finding objects like stuffies or blankets that provided comfort to them. And then young people also reported having greater levels of worry for other people in the world. And they had concern about their own and about other young people's development during this time. And young people who were at transition points, who were going into high school or leaving high school, for example, told us that they were feeling especially challenged. We found changes in young people's relationships.
Next slide. There you go, Matt.
Try this again. So as we're sort of reviewing and sort of speaking to what our next steps will be, we really wanted to bring together the notion that distress, it's commonplace. No, can't hear. Can you step in?
Sorry, Annette, you're frozen. So at how the data of the pandemic and the implications for us. Annette, are you hearing me? You take over now. Go ahead.
Thanks, Amani. So we're really looking at how we move forward from some of what we already know and what we've already heard and what we're seeing through things like the Kids Help Phone and in terms of what they've shared with us, what they've seen as well. To start to say, so what do we within PSS do to create spaces that encourage that movement forward, to create those healing spaces, to create that engagement, and to ensure that families have access to the resources they're going to need to move forward. So, I think it's things like us starting to center ourselves on doing things like the social skills groups, reskilling connectedness amongst students and giving them voice in terms of what they need right now, advocating for them on their behalf to know that, we hear what they're asking of us as they return into this quote unquote normal year for the first time in the last 3 years. Some of our students are returning again after being away for several years, right? How do we start to build those bridges back for them and build those connections back, and spaces that, encourage play, encourage fun, encourage, access to just being a kid again. As much as we want to catch our kids up, as much as we want to move them on with, their skills in terms of their academics, what do we need to do to support them just to find their way again in their school spaces? And so what are those, as we start to look at this through an anti-racist and equity lens as well, as we start to unpack who we are in these roles as well.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And so we will go a little bit more in depth in our, not a little bit more, we'll go in depth in our next part 2 presentation. But, we wanted to show what unhealed trauma can look like, and we know that our system can be punitive according to different racial groups with behaviors. For complex needs, our OTPT, when our kids are stemming, and just add the intersecting of race and gender and sexuality, how as we as PSS staff can create a place of calm for these students to have a space to be able to just look at their stress, for them to get into a mind of being able to talk. So, we see the low self-esteem, the fears, that's something that will always happen, not really trusting, not being able to tolerate conflict. And so the limiting coping skills, and that's where we come in. And the resistance to positive change. When, we saw Maslow's hierarchy of need, when all they've known is negativity, that is their norm. And how do we get aspiration from Dr. Sean to really dream and to be able to look at mattering to themselves, and an innate feeling of shame, and we see that in the flooding and the flopping. What are the behaviors that come with shame and the difficulty standing up for themselves and asserting boundary, that's the fawn. And so, we have to look at what some of these behaviors look like in terms of unhealed trauma. And we're saying what they could look like, right? We're not becoming the experts, but as PSS staff, we're looking at the foundational knowledge so that we can look to tier 3 of referring on for, those with complex trauma and chronic trauma to have a treatment team to delve further. Next slide, please. And we're almost to the end. And so wanted to give you this visual of window of tolerance and trauma stress response. So you see, we as PSS staff, we hope to get into the second stage, right? We see that our students, depending on their experience, the hyperarousal, which is, the sympathetic nerve, the response, the fight or flight, the overactive, unclear, and then you add in complex needs as well and trauma. And so they need that mindfulness, grounding and breathing work, but that they're not calm. So it's hard to do. And on the other continuum, we see the shutting down, right? The flop and the flooding, the hyperarousal, the depressed, or the lethargy, the numbing, the unmotivated, and sometimes the disassociating. So, when we get students in the window of tolerance, where they're able to reason and to give them coping skills, zones of regulation, giving them these wonderful apps. If they're open to yoga, as PSS staff, we have to be creative. And I'm often, when I look at OTPT and SLP and what they do for the students that they work with, I find it fascinating because it's looking at students intersecting identities according to abilities and abilities as well. And that when they're in that window of tolerance, then that's when we can access the dreaming, we can access the skills building, and we can mentally engage them towards mental health and well-being and give them as much in their toolboxes to be able to deal with stress and tolerance. And it's through repetition. It takes 30 times consecutively practicing a new skill for it to become the norm. So we just wanted to give you this visual of where we're going to go in part 2, which is looking at actions and clinical implications for us. Next slide, please. And so Shameen has already spoken about, although this presentation was developed by us, it came inspired by so many people, and the pandemic had put a drastic stop and pause. And because of the inequities and, the TDSB multi-year strategic plan is about mental health literacy and language and about equity and dismantling institutional racism. And so now that we understand that racism and social identities are also part of anti-oppression, anti-racism, it naturally has to be included in our trauma presentation. So it is timely, and we just want to thank everyone for their contribution. Next slide, please. And so, Annette, can you explain this? Yes. Oh, wait, is Shameen here? Is she back?
Yeah, she's back.
Okay,
Hi.
go ahead, Shameen.
Sorry, jump back in. Thank you. Thanks, Annette. I know in this era of virtual stuff, our internets are hit and miss sometimes, but thank you both
Dodgy.
very, very much. If everybody can just take this QR code, there's a very brief, I promise, survey on it that we've just created as we move forward with our PSS learnings around trauma-informed and basing it in equity. And part of what we know is very essential in trauma also is self-care and finding and being more conscious of how we're feeling and how we're supporting each other, and also where our limits are because of our own stress levels. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in the next presentations. So we're just going to keep this on maybe for about a minute. If people can take a screenshot from their phone and just complete the survey, it will help navigate some of the learnings as we move forward. Did I miss anything, Amani, Annette?
No, I don't know if our Q&As enacted or if we stop recording and then we go to our Q&A. I see there's one in the Q&A. Can I?
Actually, somebody
it
said
it
Rosh,
needs permission. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Let me.
Roshni, could you
I'll go in as well and see if we can enact
just give
that.
us one moment?
Thanks for letting us know. Appreciate that. Annette, you are the owner, so can you go in?
I'm on it.
Okay.
Are you logged in as your TDSB account, maybe?
Oh, someone said Shelley was able to access it. Can't open the link. Can you put the link in the chat? Is the chat enabled? Let's see. No, the chat is, let's see. I'm going to type something. Can you guys see my Ds? Host and panelists, it's just for us.
Amani, you can change that.